Before Walmart, before Amazon, there was Main Street, where every handshake meant something, and the butcher knew your name. In the 1970s, small-town America still carried the echoes of a slower, more personal rhythm of life. The heart of a community wasn't a sprawling mall or a glowing screen. It was the row of shops that lined Main Street. It was where families gathered their groceries, where kids pedaled their bikes with a few coins in their pockets, and where neighbors lingered in doorways just to catch up. These places were more than storefronts. They were the backdrop of memory. A trip to town meant more than running errands. The butcher would hand-wrap your order in paper, slipping an extra cut for loyalty. The barber knew your family history as well as your haircut preference. And the five and dime shop offered a mix of candy, sewing notions, and small treasures that kept kids wide-eyed. It was a time when businesses weren't just businesses. They were extensions of the community itself. Owners often knew customers by name, and conversations stretched longer than transactions. Trust was built into the system. Many families bought groceries on store credit, their names penciled onto handwritten tabs to be paid later. There were no apps, no loyalty cards, no corporate tracking, only a belief in honesty and reputation. Children ran errands with a dollar bill or loose change, learning early the responsibility of handling money and the joy of independence. A bottle of soda or a bag of penny candy felt like a reward earned through trust. These routines stitched together the fabric of daily life. Families didn't just shop, they connected. A walk downtown meant stopping to wave at neighbors, glancing at the hardware store window display, or peeking into the bakery to smell fresh bread. The sounds of screen doors slamming, bells jingling above shop entrances, and the shuffle of feet on worn wooden floors painted a rhythm of belonging. Even in bigger towns, Main Street offered a sense of intimacy that made life feel grounded. Looking back, it is easy to see how deeply these small rituals shaped the memories of the baby boomer and early Gen X generations. They recall the pride of being sent to the store alone, the thrill of buying a comic book with spare change, or the warmth of being greeted by name by adults who treated them as part of the community. These everyday habits seem small now, but they carried weight. They gave people a place to belong, a space where life felt steady and familiar. But time doesn't stand still, and neither did America's way of shopping. It started with smaller, bigger stores, bigger parking lots. At first, it was exciting, but it would change everything. In the late 1960s and through the 1970s, the way Americans shopped began to shift in ways that seemed subtle at the time, but would reshape daily life. The corner butcher and the five and dime hadn't disappeared yet, but new kinds of stores were arriving, carrying with them the promise of convenience, variety, and lower prices. Families embraced these changes, not yet realizing what they might cost. The first sign of this shift was the appearance of larger stores on the outskirts of towns. Instead of narrow storefronts squeezed along Main Street, these new spaces offered room to roam wide aisles, bigger selections, and the luxury of pushing a shopping cart instead of carrying bags from shop to shop. Parking lots became a major selling point, allowing families to drive right up to the entrance and load their car in one stop. For suburban neighborhoods growing rapidly during this period, these stores were a natural fit. Families were drawn in by the variety. Where a local grocer might carry a few dozen items, the new supermarkets offered hundreds. Suddenly, shoppers could find international foods, bulk goods, and brands competing for attention all under the same roof. Department stores followed the same pattern, pulling together clothing, appliances, and toys into one destination. A single trip that once required multiple stops on Main Street could now be completed more efficiently, saving time for busy households. The prices helped too. Chain stores with their larger supply networks could undercut smaller competitors, offering discounts that made it hard for families to resist. In a decade defined by inflation, wage struggles, and changing family dynamics, stretching a dollar mattered. Parents weighed the convenience and savings against loyalty to local businesses, and increasingly, the larger stores won out. Yet beneath the excitement of these changes lay a hidden cost. The new stores, by their very nature, weakened ties to the small businesses that had anchored towns for generations. Customers no longer relied on a shopkeeper who knew their name or a clerk who carried a family tab. Shopping became more anonymous, more efficient, and less personal. While few recognized it at the time, the seeds were being planted for the decline of Main Street culture. The 1970s marked a transition point, when shopping began to shift from being a deeply social act into something more transactional. For many families, it was a welcome change, a chance to embrace progress. But for communities built on familiarity and trust, it was the first sign that something irreplaceable might soon be lost. But before the giants claimed the edge of town, they quietly set up shop on Main Street itself. Woolworths had grilled cheese. Jack Penny had creaky floors. Even the chains once felt like home. In the 1970s, national brands were already spreading across the country, but they hadn't yet grown into the faceless giants we think of today. Instead, they tucked themselves onto Main Street, rubbing shoulders with local barbers, drugstores, and diners. Walking into Sears or Woolworths didn't feel like stepping into a corporate box. It felt like entering another part of the same community. These stores still carried local character. They were designed to blend into the rhythm of the street, often housed in brick-fronted buildings that looked no different from their neighbors. The aisles were narrower, the layouts cozier, and the atmosphere more personal than the sprawling versions that would arrive later. Customers weren't just numbers. They were neighbors. Clerks might live down the block, and managers often recognized families by sight. Shopping in a chain store still came with the comfort of being known. Lunch counters made many of these places feel more like gathering spots than retail outlets. Woolworths was famous for its grilled cheese sandwiches and milkshakes, while Jack Penny and Sears often had catalog desks where families came not just to order, but to chat while flipping through thick books of possibilities. These spaces turned errands into social experiences, where children sat on stools sipping sodas while parents swapped stories with staff. For many families, certain brands became tied to tradition. A back-to-school trip to Jack Penny might mean new shoes that squeaked down the hallway on the first day of class. A Christmas gift from Sears catalog pages might hold a special place under the tree. Even though these were chain stores, they carried emotional weight, weaving themselves into the fabric of everyday life. The personal touches mattered. Store credit could still be arranged in some places with a handshake, and small courtesies, like a clerk setting aside an item for a regular, gave shoppers a sense of belonging. The blend of national reach and local service created a balance that felt stable, even comforting. Looking back, it's easy to see why these stores were so loved. They offered variety and reliability while still feeling grounded in small-town values. They didn't yet have the sterile uniformity that malls and superstores would later impose. For baby boomers growing up in this era, chain stores on Main Street carry both the excitement of modern shopping and the intimacy of community connection. But it wasn't long before these beloved names followed the money and the cars. The superstores didn't just sell more. They redefined what shopping meant in America. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, malls and big-box retailers began to rise, pulling shoppers away from the intimacy of Main Street and into cavernous spaces filled with fluorescent lights and endless aisles. What had once been a stroll down a street, lined with neighbors, became a drive to a parking lot outside a concrete box. At first, the scale was dazzling. There was more of everything. More clothes, more gadgets, more food all in one place. But as the shelves grew longer, something essential began to shrink. National chains began to look identical no matter where they were built. A Sears in Ohio looked the same as one in California. A Jack Penny in Kansas offered the same displays as one in Florida. The quirks of local architecture, the charm of creaky wooden floors or neon signs above a diner-style lunch counter, were replaced with uniform layouts and glossy tile. This sameness provided predictability, but it stripped towns of individuality. A shopping trip no longer told you much about the community you were in. It told you about the corporation you were buying from. Quantity, price, and speed became the driving values. Families traded personal service for bargains, long conversations for checkout lines, and small gestures of community for carts piled high. The rise of one-stop shopping was efficient, but it made shopping transactional rather than relational. People left with bags full of goods, but without the warm familiarity of having spoken to someone who knew their family's name. Even architecture reflected the change. Where main streets had been filled with storefronts and gathering spots, malls were enclosed, climate-controlled spaces with skylights and food courts. They offered a new kind of social life, one where teenagers gathered under neon lights. Arcade tokens jingled in pockets, and window displays were designed by marketing teams rather than local owners. The mall became the hub of culture, replacing the town square. But it was a culture shaped more by commerce than by community ties. For main streets across America, the shift was devastating. As families flocked to malls and big-box centers, foot traffic on traditional shopping streets dwindled. Window displays went dark, familiar signs were taken down, and the personal touches of local shops slowly faded. What was once the heartbeat of a town became quieter with every passing year. The big box boom delivered convenience, but it came with a cost measured in more than dollars. It reshaped how Americans defined community and connection, turning shopping into an impersonal act rather than a shared experience. Looking back, it is hard not to see the glow of fluorescent lights as the moment when Main Street as unique character began to dim. And once the giants left, Main Street began to fade store by store, window by window. The barber closed. The bell on the door stopped ringing. And just like that, Main Street went quiet. For generations, these small shops had been the heartbeat of American towns. They weren't just places to buy things. They were where stories were shared, friendships formed, and daily life unfolded. But as foot traffic dwindled and customers drove past Main Street on their way to the mall or the big box store, the little shops that once defined community life began to disappear. The closures came gradually at first. A shoe store shut down after decades when the owner retired, unable to find someone willing to take over. The hardware store, once a gathering place for weekend projects and advice, couldn't compete with the lower prices of chain stores. The neighborhood bakery that filled the air with the smell of bread each morning closed its doors, leaving behind an empty window where wedding cakes and birthday treats once stood. For those who grew up in these places, the loss felt personal. A barber wasn't just someone who cut hair. He was someone who remembered a child's first trim, who asked about school, who watched generations grow up from his chair. A corner drugstore wasn't only where prescriptions were filled. It was where kids sat at the counter with milkshakes and where neighbors bumped into each other while picking up aspirin or magazines. When these doors closed, they took with them not only a business, but a part of people's lives. The physical decline of Main Street reflected the emotional one. Empty storefronts stood with paint peeling and windows covered in dust. Signs faded in the sun, letters missing or falling away. Where once there had been the bustle of shoppers and the chatter of familiar voices, there was only silence, interrupted by the occasional echo of footsteps or the creak of an abandoned sign in the wind. The emptiness was more than visual. It was felt in the hearts of those who remembered what it used to be. What made this collapse even harder was the loss of generational memory. For children of the 1970s and 80s, growing up without those Main Street rituals meant losing touch with a way of life that had shaped their parents and grandparents. Trips to town no longer meant stopping at 3 or 4 stores, waving at neighbors, and sharing small moments of connection. Instead, it became about efficiency, loading everything into a cart at one massive store and heading back to the car without speaking to anyone along the way. Nostalgia lingers for those places. People look back and remember the bells on the doors, the creak of wooden floors, the smell of leather shoes or fresh bread. They remember being recognized, being greeted, being part of something smaller and more human. And they recognize that once those places disappeared, something vital in American life went with them. But it wasn't just stores we lost. It was something deeper. We gained speed, but lost our stories. Was it really worth it? The promise of progress in the 1970s and beyond was efficiency. Fewer stops, quicker shopping, more options under one roof. And for many families, that promise was delivered. Groceries, clothing, and household goods could all be picked up in a single trip, saving time in lives that were becoming increasingly busy. But what disappeared in exchange for that speed was harder to see at first: the quiet daily stories that once gave shopping its soul. In the big box stores and malls, interactions became brief, almost transactional. Clerks rang up purchases without much conversation, and shoppers blended into long lines of strangers. The small moments that once defined the community, the butcher remembering your favorite cut of meat, the druggist asking how your family was doing, the barber passing on town news, were replaced with quick exchanges and plastic bags. Convenience was won, but at the cost of losing the relationships that had made errands feel personal. As the years passed, many communities began to notice the emotional effects. Shopping felt lonelier. Instead of running into neighbors on Main Street or lingering at a lunch counter, families now parked in vast lots, loaded their trunks, and drove away without speaking to anyone. The sense of belonging that once came from familiar storefronts faded into anonymity. Customers were reduced to numbers, and neighborhoods lost the daily rhythm of gathering in shared spaces. Traditions tied to those shops began to vanish as well. No more Saturday morning trips to the bakery for fresh rolls. No more holiday windows decorated by hand. No more catalog pickups that turned into community visits. These small rituals were more than transactions. They were threads that held families and towns together. Their loss revealed how deeply community life had been tied to the act of shopping locally. What emerged in its place was a culture increasingly centered on consumerism itself. The focus shifted from people to products, from relationships to sales. Stores no longer sold experiences grounded in connection. They sold efficiency, low prices, and volume. For a time, this felt like progress. But gradually, the emptiness of it became clearer. The very convenience that made life easier also made it less connected, leaving many with the sense that something human had been traded away. Looking back, the cost of progress wasn't just economic, it was emotional. The main streets that once served as cultural anchors became quieter, and the bonds they nurtured grew weaker. What disappeared wasn't simply the stores themselves, but the stories they carried, the daily reminders of who we were together. And just when Main Street thought it couldn't get worse, something even bigger arrived. Then came Amazon, and the store in your town became a website. What began in the 1990s as a novelty quickly turned into a revolution, one that swept away decades of tradition almost overnight. Suddenly, shopping no longer required a drive to Main Street or even to the mall. It required only a computer screen and a few clicks. By the early 2000s, the digital avalanche was in full force, rewriting how Americans bought everything from books to groceries. E-commerce reshaped habits in ways that once seemed unimaginable. Stores that had survived the mall era now faced a new kind of competitor, one that never closed, never ran out of packing spaces, and could deliver almost anything to a doorstep. Sears, once the titan of catalogs and department stores, crumbled under the weight of online shopping. Other legacy chains followed, unable to match the speed and scope of the digital marketplace. The appeal was irresistible. Why wait for the weekend to run errands when you could shop at midnight in your pajamas? Why settle for the limited inventory of a local store when an online search revealed endless options? The convenience eclipsed tradition with stunning speed, leaving behind a culture where patience became unnecessary. Packages arriving at the door replaced the ritual of loading bags into a car. Browsing websites replaced wandering aisles. What once required effort now came with instant gratification. But with that convenience came a profound loss. The tangible experiences that once defined shopping, chatting with a clerk, feeling the weight of a tool in your hand, flipping through books in a store, were replaced by sterile digital transactions. Screens filtered out the sensory details that once made purchases feel memorable. A glowing confirmation email carried none of the warmth of a familiar shopkeeper or the charm of a local window display. The digital avalanche didn't just transform shopping. It accelerated the collapse of the physical spaces that had already been struggling. Malls that once served as teenage hangouts grew quiet. Anchor stores closed their doors. Even big-box giants began to feel the pressure. Entire landscapes of retail architecture were abandoned, left as shells of a world that no longer needed them. It was efficient, yes. It was practical, but it left many wondering if something vital had been lost in the process. Shopping had once been about more than just buying. It had been about belonging, about connection, about ritual. Now it was about speed and ease, stripped of the human ties that once made it matter. But just as it all seemed lost, something surprising began to happen. A new generation is discovering the charm of old storefronts and breathing life into the past. After decades of decline, some main streets across America are stirring again. Their boarded windows replaced with bright displays, their dusty floors swept clean for new beginnings. What once seemed like relics of another era are finding relevance in a world that, after years of speed and convenience, is beginning to crave something more personal, more human. Revival movements have taken root in small towns and cities alike. Community groups and local governments have invested in restoring historic buildings, peeling away years of neglect to reveal the brickwork, wood, and character that had been hidden beneath. Old theaters are reopening with indie films and live music, while long-forgotten storefronts are welcoming new life in the form of small businesses that prize connection over scale. Walking down these streets today feels like stepping into the past, but with a fresh twist. Artisan shops have become central to this revival. Instead of mass-produced goods, these stores offer handmade pottery, unique clothing, or carefully crafted furniture. Coffee houses and bakeries, often with vintage decor and a focus on local ingredients, serve as modern-day lunch counters, places where people gather, linger, and connect. Farmers' markets have become weekly rituals, drawing crowds not just for fresh produce, but for the experience of talking with growers, hearing live music, and feeling part of a shared rhythm again. Nostalgia is a powerful force behind this return. Many younger Americans who never experienced Main Street in its prime are drawn to the idea of authenticity and simplicity. They want to know where their goods come from, who made them, and how they fit into the community. For older generations, these spaces spark memories of childhood errands, family routines, and the comfort of being recognized. Together, this mix of memory and discovery has given Main Street a second chance. This shift is also tied to broader cultural trends. The rise of slow living encouraged people to resist constant speed and convenience in favor of experiences that feel meaningful and connected. Supporting local businesses has become not only a practical choice, but a statement of values, a way of investing in community rather than corporations. Every cup of coffee bought at a local cafe or loaf of bread picked up from a neighborhood bakery carries with it a sense of participation in something larger than a transaction. It's a quiet revolution, but one that suggests progress, doesn't always mean leaving the past behind. Sometimes it means returning to it with new appreciation, blending the lessons of history with the needs of today. Because no matter how much changes, one truth still holds. Main Street isn't just a place. It's a feeling. And in some towns, it's coming back to life. Even after decades of decline, its memory never really vanished. It lingers in the minds of those who grew up with its rhythms. The sound of a shop bell jingling, the creak of a wooden floor, the warmth of being greeted by name. For baby boomers, Gen X, and even younger generations, Main Street continues to stand as a symbol of what community once meant and what it can still mean today. At its heart, Main Street represents connection. It's a reminder that shopping wasn't only about products, but about people. It was built on trust, on store tabs scribbled in pencil, on handshakes, on clerks setting aside items for loyal customers. That trust hasn't disappeared completely. You can still find it in small towns where hardware stores lend advice as freely as they sell mails, or where family diners know your order before you sit down. The traditions may be fewer, but the value behind them remains timeless. Generational pride is also fueling its revival. Many younger entrepreneurs, inspired by the nostalgia of their parents and grandparents, are reopening spaces once thought lost. They are restoring historic storefronts, reviving forgotten recipes in bakeries, and bringing back the craftsmanship that once defined small-town life. For older generations, these efforts feel like a bridge to the past, a way of preserving not just architecture but identity. Main Street lives on in the pride communities feel when they choose local over corporate. Reflecting on its history, Main Street tells a larger story about America itself. It carries the memory of freedom and independence, but also the lessons of progress, both its gains and its costs. It reminds us of the comfort of belonging, but also the importance of adapting to new times. Nostalgia alone cannot bring it back, but it can inspire a balance. Progress that doesn't forget its roots. Modern life that leaves room for connection. In the end, Main Street is more than a row of shops. It is the American heart that still beats, even if faintly. It's a feeling stitched into memory, one that reminds people of who they were and who they want to be. The details may change the stores, the fashions, the faces, but the essence of Main Street remains alive in every community that values connection over convenience. And that leaves a question worth asking. What do we want to preserve? And what are we willing to let fade? Because the truth is, Main Street never really left. It has been waiting, quietly, for us to remember. Which part of Main Street do you remember most? And what would you bring back if you could? Share your memories in the comments below.